Okay, so we're going to talk about geometric series. Now you know from arithmetic series that a series is just the sum of a sequence. So what we're going to work on today is everything that we're dealing with is a geometric sequence, and now there's going to be addition signs between the terms because we're going to be adding them together. We're going to be finding the sum, which is what turns it into a series. So you've seen these variables before. This s sub n is the sum of n terms. That's what that s sub n means. A1, that's your first term. That has not changed. That's consistent with everything we've done. R is your common ratio. And remember from the previous lesson that R cannot be 1. It has to be either greater than or less than 1. And then N is strictly the number of terms. So we've got this formula, a sub 1 times 1 minus r to the n all over 1 minus r. So we're going to find the indicated sum for each geometric series. In order to do that, we need to fill in all the pieces of our formula. So first things first, we see s sub 6. So s sub 6 means we're going to find the sum of 6 terms. So that's telling us that n equals 6. We need a1 also from our formula. So a1, we're looking at our series here, a1 is going to be 2. And then we also need to figure out what r is. So looking at what r is, we find r by taking a2 divided by a1, so that's going to give us 1/2. Okay, so that r, that's that common ratio, that's that number that we're multiplying by every single time to make sure that we have our pattern. So now that I have n, a1, and r, I can go ahead and plug this into my formula. So a1, 2 times 1 minus my ratio of 1/2. I always go ahead and put my ratio in parentheses because if it is negative, we want to make sure we're following order of operations. We're doing that 1/2 to the 6th power first. Close parentheses, all over 1 minus 1/2. So be very careful here. Some of the better calculators, you should be able to type this all in just how it looks, but I would kind of do this one at a time. So 2 times 1 minus 1/2 to the 6th power. When you type that in, you get 1 over 64. All over 1 minus 1/2 is just going to be 1/2. So if you do 1 minus 1 over 64, we're going to get 2 times 63 over 64 divided by 1/2. So if you go ahead and multiply 63 over 64 times 2, kind of think about those fractions there, that's going to become a 32. So now we have 63 over 32 divided by 1/2. I like to think of it that way because now I can see I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So 63 divided by 32 times 2. So now those are going to cancel out, and I'm going to end up with a final answer of 63 over 16. We will expect you to leave these in simplest fraction form. Okay, so looking at example B now, we need to find our first term, our ratio, and our n from our formula. So our first term is going to be this 32 right here. Our n is going to be top minus bottom plus 1, which just ended up being 4. But you always want to check that because if you're not starting with that sequence at 1, then it's going to affect your n value. And then the r is that value that's in the parentheses, and that's going to be negative 1/4. I'm going to go ahead and plug this into my formula. So I'll have s sub 4 equals a1 times 1 minus my ratio of negative 1/4 to the 4th power, all over 1 minus negative 1/4. So a couple of things here. Put that negative 1/4 in parentheses because when we take the negative 1/4 to the 4th power right over here, you're going to want to realize that that negative to that even exponent is going to become positive. And then also down here, that minus a negative is going to become plus a positive. So as I type this into my calculator and I do negative 1/4 to the 4th power, I'm going to get positive 1 over 256. So my next line here is going to be 32 times 1 minus 1 over 256 all over that denominator. 1 plus 1/4 is going to become 5/4. So now if I did 1 minus 256, so I'm going to end up with, I'm going to go this way, guys, you go on your paper the other way, 32 times 255 over 256 all divided by 5/4. So go ahead and simplify that 32 over 256. And now we're going to end up with 255 over 8 divided by 5/4. So change that to 255 over 8 times 4 over 5, because you're multiplying by the reciprocal. And that simplifies to be 51 over 2. So you really could probably type all of this into your calculator at that point, especially if you have one of those calculators like we have in class. But if you can't, if you have one of those like dark blue calculators that kind of do things step by step, then you'll want to make sure that you're showing all your steps here. Again, simplified fractions for your final answer. Okay, so we're still trying to find the sum. Now, in order to find the sum, remember that you need to have your first term. So my first term here is 2. We need to have our ratio. Our ratio is 4 over 2, which is also 2. And then we also need to figure out what n is. Now, since we don't have what n is, that means we have to go back and find n. So if you don't have what you're looking for in your S formula, then you have to go back to your A formula. So we're going to use A sub n to find n, okay? Use your A sub n formula. So remember our A sub n formula. A sub n equals A sub 1 times r to the n minus 1. So we know our an. Our an is our last term here, that 256. So I'll plug that in. 256 equals a1 is that first term of 2 times the ratio of 2 to the n minus 1. So you can't multiply 2 times 2 here because that exponent. So what you're going to have to do is divide by 2. Now I'm going to have 128 equals 2 to the n minus 1. So think way back before winter break, we had solving problems where we had to solve for the variable and the exponents. Remember what we did was we had to log each side. So we're going to go back to logs for a second. Now I'm going to choose to take the log base 2 of each side. And I'm going to choose log base 2 because I have an exponent base 2. Remember, logs and exponents undo each other. So this log base 2 of 2 right here, those are going to cancel each other out. And I'm going to have that equal to n minus 1. Well, remember that log base 2 of 128, remember that's just a number. You type that in your calculator like this, log 128 divided by log of 2. So when you type that in your calculator, you end up getting that 7 equals n minus 1. I'll add 1 to each side, and you get that n equals 8. So we can go ahead and take away our question mark now and see that n equals 8. So now that we have everything that we need to find our sum, we can go ahead and plug it into our sum formula. So S sub 8 equals A1, which is 2, times 1 minus R, which is also 2, to the 8th power, that's the n that we just found, divided by 1 minus 2. So go ahead and type that in your calculator. 2 times 1 minus 2 to the 8th is going to be 256. So 1 minus 256 is 2 times negative 255 all over negative 1. And that's going to give us 510. And you're done. So this last one here, I think you should really try to do that on your own. So you should pause the video right now, try to do it on your own, and then check your work with my video that I'm creating for you. So I'm going to go ahead and find my A sub 1, which is negative 3, my R, which is in the parentheses of 2, and then my N, which is top number minus bottom number plus 1, which ends up being 6. It's usually what that top number is, but not always, so be careful. So go ahead and plug that into our formula then. S sub 6 equals A1 times 1 minus R to the N all over 1 minus R. So go ahead and do that 2 to the 6th, and we'll have negative 3 times 1 minus 64 all over negative 1. So negative 3 times negative 63 divided by negative 1. So that's going to give us a positive 189 over negative 1, which means our answer is negative 189. Check your